They say you never truly know what hidden power someone holds until a single moment exposes it for the world to see. For one unassuming mother on a crowded flight from Atlanta, Georgia, that moment arrived when her family was belittled, ignored, and pushed beyond reason. The cabin buzzed with tension. Passengers looked away in discomfort, and the flight crew tightened their lips in stony silence. Then, in a flash of authority and self-assured righteousness, she pulled out her badge. The hush that fell upon the airplane was deafening. Unknown to all that soft-spoken woman was a highly respected federal judge ready to bring justice to the skies. Melissa Harding Mitchell had meticulously planned this trip for over a year. She was a proud mother of 2 vibrant children. Destiny, who had just turned 10, and Brandon, who was approaching his 12th birthday, both children full of curiosity, sharp wit, and constant questions about everything from the Earth's orbit to why certain people in the world acted with malice. Melissa adored these inquisitive qualities. In fact, she encouraged them. After all, she had built her entire career on questions, arguments, and unwavering adherence to facts as a federal judge. Melissa spent most of her days in stately courtrooms, rooms full of tension, whispered confessions, compelling arguments, and the ever-present gravitas of justice. She specialized in high-profile civil rights cases, which drew extensive media coverage. She often held the balance between large corporations and underrepresented groups, a balance she never took lightly. The public recognized her in the news, but she was also known for her discretion. Despite her prestigious office, she prided herself on humility. For her, wearing the black robe every day was a sacred duty, never something to flaunt or leverage casually. Her spouse, Anthony Mitchell, a respected science professor at a local university, often told his colleagues half-jokingly, "It's best not to argue with my wife. She's got the gavel." While that quip usually elicited laughs, Anthony deeply admired Melissa's commitment to fairness and truth. Their family formed a strong unit, built on mutual respect, humor, and unwavering support. They lived near the bustling center of Atlanta, Georgia. From their home, it was a short drive to Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, widely known to be one of the busiest airports in the world. Because the children had earned good marks in school, and also to celebrate the successful conclusion of a complicated case, Melissa had presided over, the family decided a vacation was overdue. The plan was to fly to Honolulu, Hawaii, for a sunny, rejuvenating break, before the kids had to dive into yet another semester. Tickets were booked with Delta Airlines, a brand they trusted due to its vast network and mostly reliable service. They'd splurged on tickets that would allow them just enough space in Comfort Plus seating. They were not in first class, but they expected courtesy and basic respect, nothing fancy, just to be treated like any other paying passenger. They never imagined that on this day they would test not only the airline's courtesy, but the moral fortitude of an entire flight crew. On the morning of departure, the Mitchells arrived at the airport bright and early. The atmosphere in the terminal was charged with excitement. Travelers bustled about hauling suitcases, searching for departure gates, or waiting in line at coffee shops. Anthony teased the kids about the beach they'd soon see, describing in great detail the color of the water and the texture of the sand. It was a much-needed break for everyone. Especially Melissa, who had spent the last 6 months reading through endless motions and presiding over a tense corporate ethics trial. They made it through security without incident. No one recognized Melissa, or if they did, they gave no sign. She wore simple jeans, a cozy sweater, and carried a sleek leather bag containing her laptop and case files, ever the dutiful jurist. Quiet, calm, determined. That was how Melissa carried herself. People often assumed she was a teacher or some mid-level corporate employee traveling for work. She never minded. In fact, she found solace in anonymity whenever it found her. When the gate agent announced boarding, the Mitchell family joined the line, designated for those with special seating arrangements, including families with small children. Melissa and Anthony wanted to ensure they had enough time to store their carry-ons and get the kids settled. Their children were old enough not to need constant supervision, but in the chaos of boarding it was best to stick together. Yet from the start, something felt off. The gate agent barely acknowledged them, barely gave eye contact, and mumbled instructions in a tone that bordered on dismissive. Melissa attributed this to the stress of the day. It was busy after all. But she couldn't ignore that other passengers, those not belonging to her family, received smiles, eye contact, and even small banter about their destination. Melissa filed the observation away in the back of her mind. It was not so unusual to suspect some mild annoyance from overworked airline staff, but the difference in warmth for other travelers, especially white travelers, was subtle and disturbing. She told herself that once they were seated, the day would look brighter. They had a long flight ahead, and the beach was waiting. Nothing could have prepared her for the series of events that would unfold at 30,000 feet. As soon as the Mitchells stepped on board, they felt an undercurrent of tension. The flight attendants seemed rushed, their greetings perfunctory. This was not unusual during a busy boarding process. Yet Melissa noticed how one of the attendants, a tall woman with a rigid posture and a polished smile, gave a warm welcome to the passenger in front of them, a middle-aged white gentleman. When it was their turn, her smile flickered, and she simply nodded, as if waiting for them to hurry along. Melissa quietly took a breath. She wasn't looking for trouble. She tried her best not to read too deeply into every slight, but it bothered her when the attendant's eyes flicked around them, as if scanning for someone more important to greet. She guided the kids toward their row, letting Anthony stow the carry-on luggage in the overhead bin. Unfortunately, there was limited space in that overhead compartment. A few seats down, a large duffel bag jutted out, hogging the space meant for multiple carry-ons. They'd have to store one of their bags, several rows behind them. Brandon, who was old enough to notice unfair treatment, whispered to his mother, "Why is everyone so weird?" She patted his shoulder and whispered back that they should remain calm and polite. "We're tired. They're tired," she said, "and everything will be all right once we're in the air." They settled into their seats. The plane filled quickly and overhead compartments snapped shut. Flight attendants hustled back and forth, counting heads and ensuring seatbelts were buckled. Yet despite all the bustle, not one attendant stopped by to greet the Mitchell family or confirm the kids were comfortable. Melissa realized they were being overlooked, but overshadowing that concern was something else that triggered her protective instincts, the stifling overhead air. The cabin felt unusually hot and the children were already complaining about it. "Mum, I'm sweating," Destiny murmured, wiping her forehead. Anthony waved his hand in front of his face. He joked, "If they don't get the AC going, soon we might land in Honolulu already dehydrated." Melissa activated the overhead vent. Warm air trickled out. She rang the call button, hoping a flight attendant could address the issue or provide a quick explanation. Maybe the engines weren't fully on. Maybe they needed the door closed. She had flown enough to know. Sometimes it took a few extra minutes to start the air conditioning system. The kids, however, were borderline uncomfortable. Brandon asked for water. Melissa pressed the call button again, but no one came. Adjacent passengers also seemed uncomfortable. A few took out portable fans from their bags. One woman began fanning herself with an in-flight menu. A man 2 rows ahead cursed under his breath, complaining about the heat. Another flight attendant brushed past, but made no effort to respond to the blinking call light above Melissa's seat. At length, Melissa flagged down a passing attendant, an older gentleman with silver hair and a name tag that read, Carl. She explained the situation calmly, stating, "It's very hot here. My children are uncomfortable. Could we please get some water or an update on when the AC will be working properly?" Carl gave a tight-lipped smile. "We're about to push back, ma'am. The air system takes a moment to kick in once the engines are at full power. Please be patient." Then, before Melissa could inquire further, he turned his attention to a passenger 1 row behind them who was gesturing for something. That conversation, however, ended in Carl graciously promising to get them a cool beverage right away. Melissa noted that passenger was a younger white woman with no children in tow. Confusion and annoyance began to swirl in Melissa's mind. The flight attendant had essentially brushed Melissa off while promising immediate service to someone else. Brandon sighed audibly. "Is it because we're black?" His words were quiet but unvarnished. Melissa closed her eyes momentarily, her heart hurting that her preteen child even had to wonder about such discrimination. She wanted to reassure him, but she also didn't want to lie. She quietly said, "We can't jump to conclusions, but if something's not right, you can be sure we'll address it." The plane eventually pushed back from the gate. The safety announcements droned through the speakers. Melissa discreetly opened the safety pamphlet for the kids to look at, trying to occupy them. The plane taxied, but the cabin still felt muggy. Passengers around them were still complaining. Some had rung their call buttons and were now being handed small paper cups of water. Everyone except the Mitchell family, it seemed. Carl breezed by them again, ignoring the half-raised hand from Destiny, who was too polite to speak loudly. Anthony sat quietly, a muscle twitching in his jaw. He hated confrontation, but he also hated seeing his family dismissed. He looked over at Melissa silently, asking if she wanted him to step in. Melissa gave him a subtle shake of her head. She was all too used to the calculations. If they made too big a fuss before takeoff, would they be escorted off the plane for unruly behavior? She had seen stories of people being removed from flights simply for speaking up. In short order, the plane took off into a bright, cloudless sky. The seatbelt sign switched off, and there was an audible sigh of relief across the cabin, likely from passengers anticipating cooler air at cruising altitude. For a few minutes, Melissa busied herself by speaking to the kids about the plan once they landed. Find the rental car, check in at the resort, maybe catch some dinner by the beach. The children brightened at the thought of the ocean, or maybe at the promise of shaved ice. If only the rest of the flight crew's behavior would lighten up too. Shortly after the seatbelt sign turned off, beverage service began. A second flight attendant, an exceedingly neat woman with short blonde hair, pinned tight to her head, began handing out cups of water and soft drinks. She was accompanied by another attendant who pushed a cart. They served passenger after passenger, chatting politely with those in their row. But when they reached the Mitchell family, the blonde attendant, her name tag reading Denise, bypassed them without so much as a glance. She handed drinks to the person sitting immediately behind them, skipping them entirely. This time, Anthony found his voice. "Excuse me, my kids need water," he said, tapping the corner of the attendant's cart gently to get her attention. Denise turned, feigning surprise. "Oh, I'm sorry. I must have missed you," she said, but her tone remained guarded. The apology lacked any real warmth or sincerity. She poured water into plastic cups, but the short fill line left them barely half full. Denise handed the cups to Anthony and didn't offer anything else. Melissa spoke up. "Could I also have a can of ginger ale, please?" She rarely drank soda, but the recycled cabin air was making her stomach churn. A fizzy drink might help. Denise nodded, but instead of opening a can for her, she barked at the attendant behind her. "Can we get a ginger ale for row 16? That attendant rummaged around in the cart. Meanwhile, Denise turned without waiting and walked forward, continuing the service. The second attendant, an apologetic-looking young man named Marcus, handed a can of ginger ale to Melissa with a small frown. He seemed to realize the awkwardness of the situation. "Let me know if you need anything else," he whispered softly, before pushing the cart forward. On a typical day, Melissa might have chalked all this up to absent-mindedness. But there was a pattern forming. She and her family had rung the call button twice both times, to no avail. Requests were brushed aside or ignored until they became insistent. There was zero engagement, zero courtesy. The Mitchells felt invisible when it came to anything beyond the forced bare minimum. Destiny drained her tiny cup of water quickly and asked for more. Anthony wanted to wait until Marcus returned, but realized that might be a long time. By now, he too was parched. "I'll go to the galley and see if I can get more," he told Melissa softly, unbuckling his seatbelt. She nodded. "Be careful," she warned, half joking, but half serious. She feared a confrontation with the unwelcoming cabin crew might escalate. Anthony made his way toward the back of the plane, weaving through the narrow aisle. Meanwhile, the flight progressed through mild turbulence. The seatbelt sign flickered on and off. The children gazed out the window, enthralled by the sight of thick clouds. Occasionally, they'd ask their mother to identify the shapes in the sky. Melissa managed a slight smile. She tried not to let the negativity overshadow what should be a fun family trip. Still, tension churned in her gut. About 5 minutes later, Anthony returned empty-handed. He quietly told Melissa that when he asked for more water, Carl simply pointed him to the cart that was already rolling down the aisle. "We're busy, sir." "You'll have to wait," Carl had said. Anthony had then asked politely for a single cup, but his request was ignored in favor of handing out cups to other passengers. It was humiliating to stand there unacknowledged, until eventually a different flight attendant told him to return to his seat for safety, due to turbulence. Melissa exhaled slowly, steadying her temper. She was known for her composure in the courtroom. She had faced screaming defense attorneys, cunning corporate lawyers, and belligerent defendants. She never lost her cool. She wasn't about to start now, especially not in front of her children. But her children had questions. "Mom." "What's going on?" Brandon asked. "Why don't they like us?" Melissa hated that question. She loathed the idea her kids felt singled out and unwanted in a space they had every right to occupy. The pang of injustice so familiar from her courtroom battles flared in her heart. "We're not doing anything wrong," she said firmly. "Sometimes people treat others unfairly, but it's not right. And we don't have to accept it quietly." Destiny, ever the curious one, asked, "Will you do something about it?" "Mom?" Melissa looked at her daughter with gentle resolve. "If this continues," she said, "yes, I will. We have rights, and we're going to stand up for ourselves." She discreetly removed a small notepad from her bag, a habit she'd developed for documenting important details. She began jotting down Time's descriptions of the flight attendants and a summary of each slight so far. She was careful to note how each was ignoring them or giving them subpar treatment. She didn't plan to make a scene. She would gather her facts. If there was one thing she had learned from her years on the bench, it was the power of documentation. 2 hours into the flight, meal service began for the longer leg to Honolulu. The Mitchell kids were restless, hungry, and bored with the in-flight entertainment selections, which they said were lame. Melissa scrolled through the movie options, trying to settle them. She and Anthony exchanged concerned glances. It was going to be a long haul if they couldn't even get basic courtesy or a glass of water without a struggle. When the meal cart rolled around, the flight attendants distributed a choice of chicken or vegetarian pasta to each row. The aromas made the children's stomachs rumble. Typically, flight attendants confirm passenger preferences. This time, once again, the Mitchell row was skipped over in the initial pass. Denise and Carl were the ones serving. They placed trays in front of the passenger in row 15, then row 17, but not row 16. "Excuse me," Melissa said loud enough this time. "We haven't been offered a meal choice." Denise, avoiding eye contact, spoke in a tight voice. "We're out of the chicken. You'll have to take pasta. 4 trays of pasta coming up." Melissa furrowed her brow. "At least ask if that's okay. My husband might have allergies, or the kids might not eat pasta." "Where's the courtesy?" Denise sighed, wearing impatience like a badge. "We only have vegetarian pasta left. Please take it or leave it. We have a full flight." Without waiting for a response, she placed 4 trays of pasta on their tray tables. Carl stared off into the distance, giving Melissa the impression he wanted no part in whatever confrontation might erupt. Anthony tried the pasta first to see if it was edible. It was lukewarm, flavorless, and a bit mushy, but it was food. He and Melissa agreed the kids needed nutrition. They encouraged the children to eat. Brandon wrinkled his nose, but eventually ate a few bites. Melissa quietly added more notes to her list, ignoring the suspicious stares from Carl, who noticed her writing. The final straw came moments later. Another passenger across the aisle, who had boarded after the Mitchells, waved over Denise to complain about the taste of the chicken meal. To Melissa's astonishment, Denise pulled out another sealed tray of chicken from the cart and handed it to the passenger with a placating smile. The passenger was white and middle-aged, with an air of entitlement. She muttered a quick thank you, and Denise practically cooed. "Anything else I can help you with?" Rage coursed through Melissa. She set her tray aside. This was no longer subtle. This was targeted discrimination, and it was playing out openly in front of her family. She locked eyes with Anthony, who gave a small nod. The time for silence had passed. Melissa called out Denise. The attendant turned slowly, wearing a look of practiced civility. "What is it, ma'am?" "What happened to being out of chicken?" Melissa asked, voice level but tinged with steel. "Why weren't we offered that option when it was clearly still available?" Denise twitched. For a moment she looked trapped, as though searching for a plausible excuse. "We just found some extras," she lied, her tone clipped and unconvincing. "It's for first-class overflow, and we typically don't serve that to economy passengers." Melissa's eyes flashed. She considered revealing her occupation right then and there, but decided to hold that card. She had an internal rule: never use her position as a judge to intimidate or bully in personal situations. But at this moment, she recognized they were dealing with something that went beyond a small inconvenience. "So you served a passenger in economy with first-class overflow." "But not us," she pressed. "Don't you see how that might appear discriminatory?" Carl glanced nervously between them. Denise stiffened. "I don't appreciate what you're implying," she said, her voice rising. "You have your meal. Please finish it and let us do our jobs." Anger crackled in the air. Other passengers around them stopped eating to watch the exchange. Some seemed sympathetic, others uncomfortable. Melissa was aware that any further escalation might get them labeled as problem passengers, but she couldn't let this pass. She reminded herself of her duty to her children to show them that unjust treatment should be confronted, not accepted. "I will let you do your jobs," Melissa said quietly. "But first, I'd like your full names." She indicated Denise and Carl. "When we land, I'll file a formal complaint for discriminatory behavior." Denise's complexion went pale. Carl cleared his throat. "That's not necessary," he said, a slight tremor in his voice. "We can resolve this amicably." "Then do so." Anthony interjected, surprising even Melissa with the firmness in his tone. "Show us the same respect you show every other passenger." Denise mumbled something under her breath, but finally acquiesced. She and Carl gave their first names, then mumbled that their last names and employee IDs would be on the official flight roster. Sensing the tension was too thick, they pivoted the cart away and moved on. Melissa exchanged a glance with Anthony, her anger and frustration pulsing. They both sighed, trying to settle their kids, who looked disheartened and a little scared. All around them, fellow passengers were either gawking or staring quietly at their trays. One older black gentleman, 2 rows in front, gave a subtle nod of solidarity. A few others averted their eyes, as if they didn't want to get involved in a potential confrontation. The atmosphere in the cabin soon settled into a tense quiet. Many passengers returned to their movies or tried to nap. The Mitchell family attempted to do the same, but the unpleasantness weighed heavily. Melissa wanted to stand up and give a speech about civil rights, about how the very act of ignoring or sidelining someone because of their race was morally and legally unacceptable. Yet she also knew that in confined spaces like airplanes, speeches could escalate situations rather than solve them. An hour later, the kids were dozing off their heads, resting uncomfortably against the window or the seat recline. Anthony scrolled through his phone's offline reading material. Melissa kept her notepad on her lap, reviewing the times and descriptions she had jotted down. She felt a cold sense of resolve building. Once they landed, she would absolutely file an official complaint with the airline. If the airline's response was insufficient, she knew precisely which regulatory bodies to contact. She also understood the next steps if it came to a lawsuit. Not that she wanted to sue. She prayed it wouldn't come to that. But sometimes institutions only corrected systemic bias when forced to. Then out of nowhere, a stewardess from first class came down the aisle, looking flustered and scanning the rows. She paused by an overhead compartment near the Mitchells. Melissa watched curiously. The stewardess was a young Latina woman named Teresa, wearing a crisp uniform, with a calm but urgent expression. She was rummaging in one of the overhead bins, presumably searching for something. A passenger in row 15 flagged Teresa down, pointing to a man slumped in his seat, breathing heavily. He was an older gentleman, with a worried-looking spouse by his side. "He's not feeling well," the spouse said, panic creeping into her voice. Teresa bent down, speaking quietly with the couple. She pressed a hand to the man's forehead, asked him questions about how he felt. Then she turned around, calling for Carl and Denise to bring a medical kit. The flight crew responded quickly to the emergency, but the confusion in the aisle soon escalated. The older man seemed to be in distress, possibly having chest pains or trouble breathing. Carl handed Teresa an oxygen tank and mask, while Denise rummaged around for the flight's AED automated external defibrillator. All 3 looked tense. They had to figure out if this was a heart attack or something less severe. Over the speakers, the pilot asked if there were any doctors or nurses on board. Melissa looked at Anthony. He was a science professor, not a medical professional. Yet the question hung in the air, is there a doctor or nurse on board, A moment later, a woman 3 rows ahead identified herself as a nurse. Another man claimed he was an EMT. They hurried over to assist. The aisle became a flurry of movement. Brandon and Destiny looked on with worry eyes wide. Melissa gently told them it was going to be all right, that sometimes people get sick on flights and the crew is trained to handle it. But the tension and the fear of a serious medical emergency replaced the earlier hostility, for a moment at least. Teresa ushered the children in row 15 aside, clearing space for the nurse and EMT to kneel next to the stricken passenger. The nurse asked for a stethoscope and blood pressure cuff, if available in the airline's kit. She also asked for water and some sugar solution in case it was low blood sugar or dehydration. The spouse looked terrified, wringing her hands and whispering a prayer under her breath. In that moment, Denise locked eyes with Melissa. It wasn't an apology, but a flicker of confusion, maybe even guilt, danced across her face. She turned away quickly, focusing on the tasks at hand. Carl muttered under his breath and rushed to assist retrieving supplies from another overhead compartment. Things got worse before they got better. The older man's pulse felt weak to the nurse, and his breathing grew shallow. He needed continuous oxygen, and the flight crew had to consider if an emergency landing was necessary. Then in the midst of the medical frenzy, the plane encountered turbulence. Seatbelt signs dinged back on, and the pilot's voice over the intercom insisted everyone remain seated. But they couldn't simply strap down the patient. He needed immediate care, and the nurse, the EMT, and the flight crew had to keep working. Over the next tense 15 minutes, the nurse directed them to elevate his legs slightly. Keep him upright for easier breathing and track his vitals. The pilot radioed ahead to arrange for emergency medical personnel upon landing in Honolulu. Thankfully, after receiving oxygen and some sugar solution, the older man's condition stabilized enough that an emergency diversion wasn't required. During the ordeal, the Mitchell family remained quietly supportive, offering their row if needed, or any supplies they might have. Anthony even asked if the man needed any special medication, cooled or stored. Melissa kept the children calm. The crisis overshadowed all else, including their prior conflict with the flight crew. Still, the memory of the crew's discriminating behavior lingered in Melissa's mind. She silently prayed the passenger would be okay. She recognized that in a life-and-death emergency, petty squabbles about water service fade away. But they do not disappear altogether. An hour after the medical scare, the plane began its descent toward Honolulu. The atmosphere had changed dramatically. Passengers remained subdued, as if the ordeal reminded them all of their vulnerability. The older gentleman was stable under watchful eyes of the nurse and the EMT, who had stepped up to help. The flight attendants hustled to prepare for landing, clearly shaken by the near emergency. Carl approached the Mitchell family as the seatbelt sign blinked on. He cleared his throat, and for the first time, Melissa saw what might have been remorse in his eyes. I'm sorry for the earlier inconvenience, he said softly, stammering over the words. We were overwhelmed. It's no excuse, but I just want to say we didn't mean to offend you or your family. Melissa regarded him carefully. She wasn't entirely convinced, yet she had no desire to hold on to anger, especially after such a stark reminder of life's fragility. We appreciate the apology, she answered, her tone measured. But please understand our perspective. Carl nodded, looking genuinely uncomfortable. I do, he said quietly, then left to resume his duties. Denise came by a few minutes later to check the overhead compartment above Melissa's row. In a stiff voice, she said, "We'll be landing soon. Please put your tray tables up." She paused, then added, "And sorry." It sounded forced, almost robotic, but at least it was an acknowledgement. Melissa gave a curt nod. She could sense the tension roiling beneath that thin veneer of civility. "If you truly regret it," Melissa said, her voice calm, "then learn from this. We all have biases. Sometimes they show up in ways that harm others, even if we don't intend to." Denise looked ready to snap back, but held her tongue. She turned, busying herself with passenger checks. This time she didn't bypass the Mitchells. She asked if the children needed anything before landing, if they had trash to dispose of. It was a stark contrast from earlier, though the courtesy now felt too little, too late. The plane touched down in Honolulu to a collective sigh of relief. Warm island air greeted them as they disembarked. Emergency medical personnel rushed in to tend to the older man who'd had the health scare. Passengers patiently waited while he was escorted off with oxygen support, the nurse by his side. Many of them offered quiet wishes for his recovery. Melissa, Anthony, and the kids took their time gathering their bags. It felt surreal to step onto Hawaiian soil. The tension of the flight still clung to them, but a wave of excitement for the impending vacation washed over the children. They wanted to run ahead to see the palm trees, feel the ocean breeze. Melissa and Anthony managed tired smiles, reminding them not to get too far ahead in the crowded walkway. On their way out, Teresa, the first-class attendant, who had helped with the medical emergency, offered a polite, almost apologetic nod to them. Her eyes seemed to hold a silent question. "Are you okay? Did you get what you needed?" Melissa gave a small smile in return. They left the plane behind, stepping into the bustle of Honolulu International Airport. Out in the main concourse, passengers parted ways. Some rushed to baggage claim, others lined up for connecting flights. Melissa found a quiet corner by the windows where sunbeams illuminated the sleek tile floors. She rummaged in her bag for her phone, her legal contacts, and the notes she had taken. Anthony gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze. "We can handle this later. Let's get to the hotel first." She nodded. Her husband was right. The kids needed rest and the sweet relief of ocean waves. They had time to file complaints. However, as they stood there, she caught a glimpse of Carl, Denise, and Marcus heading toward a staff exit. Carl looked away. Denise's face burned with an odd mixture of defiance and unease. Marcus gave a small wave, half apologetic, before they disappeared. "Mum, can we get some Hawaiian shaved ice now?" Brandon asked, tugging on her sleeve, referencing the treat she had promised. Melissa softened. The flight was over, and they were finally at their dream destination. "Yes," she said, forcing a bright smile. "Let's go collect our luggage." And thus the Mitchell family stepped into paradise, carrying both their suitcases and the weight of that flight's ugly undertones. Little did they know the aftershocks of what happened on the plane were only just beginning. A single phone call from Melissa to the airline's complaint line would set in motion events that would lead to an unexpected confrontation and an even more dramatic reveal of her true authority. The next day, after a restful night and a cheerful morning spent splashing in the Pacific, Melissa found a quiet moment on the hotel balcony to place a call to Delta Airlines' customer service. She had her notepad open the detailed timeline of events laid out before her. The tropical breeze and the distant crash of waves should have calmed her, but her pulse quickened as she navigated the automated menu. She was placed on hold, a looping instrumental version of a pop song filling her ear. When an agent finally answered, Melissa introduced herself. She calmly explained the circumstances of the flight, enumerating the repeated instances where she and her family felt ignored and singled out. She highlighted that this treatment stood in stark contrast to the courtesy shown to other notably white passengers. She was measured professional but firm. The customer service representative, a woman named Sandra, responded with polite concern. "I'm so sorry you experienced that," she said, typing away in the background. "We take such complaints very seriously. I'll open a case file for you immediately. Could you provide specific names of the crew members involved?" Melissa obliged, giving the first names she had gleaned. Denise, Carl, and Marcus, and also mentioning that the flight had a medical incident, so there would be a record from that. Sandra reassured her that this was not the standard of service Delta aimed for, and that they would investigate thoroughly. She offered a partial travel voucher as a token of apology, but Melissa politely declined. She wanted more than a monetary band-aid. She wanted the airline to address the root issue of discrimination. "What outcome do you seek?" Sandra asked. Melissa paused. "I want to see a record of improvement, an assurance that the employees responsible will be retrained or disciplined if necessary. I'm not seeking personal gain. I want Delta to commit to ensuring no other family has to endure this." Sandra promised that her complaint would be escalated. Melissa ended the call with a sense of cautious optimism. She had seen enough corporate lip service in her line of work to know that nice words don't always translate into real change. Still, she was hopeful that official channels might yield results. She resolved to keep pressing if she sensed complacency. Later that day, as she and the family enjoyed the sun-kissed Hawaiian shoreline, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the caller ID's unknown number. Instinct told her to answer. "Hello." A brisk voice on the other end identified herself as Bridget, a senior representative from the airline. She sounded concerned. "Mrs. Mitchell, we received your complaint and understand there was a serious issue of discrimination on your recent flight. We'd like more details if you're able to speak now." Melissa signaled Anthony to watch the kids frolicking in the shallow waves. She walked down the shore, phone pressed to her ear. Bridget asked pointed questions about each incident, from the moment they boarded to the discrepancies in meal service. She also hinted that the crew members had given their side of the story, which did not align with Melissa's account. According to them, the family was difficult and demanding. They claimed the Mitchells were unreasonably impatient for beverage service. Melissa's anger flared. She methodically disputed each mischaracterization, referencing Times witness seats, the nurse who helped the passenger, and the fact that multiple calls for water went unanswered. Bridget listened occasionally, interrupting to clarify. By the end of the call, Bridget sighed, her tone subdued. "Thank you for the information, Mrs. Mitchell. We take such allegations seriously. We will conduct a thorough investigation." Melissa ended the call, her heart pounding. She felt a mix of anxiety and determination. She recognized the signs of a possible corporate cover-up, or at least a smear tactic by the employees to protect themselves. It was her word against theirs, although she had a detailed record and possibly passenger witnesses. She also considered a formal complaint with the Department of Transportation, which oversaw airline discrimination issues. That evening, over a quiet dinner in the hotel restaurant, she brought Anthony up to speed. "They're trying to paint us as the problem," she said, swirling her fork around her salad. "It's exactly what I expected, but it's still infuriating." Anthony nodded, frowning. "Let them. The truth will come out." He paused, then asked in a softer tone, "Do you think it's time to reveal what you do for a living? That you're a federal judge?" Melissa sipped her water, feeling the weight of that decision. "I hate pulling that card," she confessed. "It feels like an abuse of power. But maybe if they realize they can't just brush us aside, They'll take this more seriously. She gazed out at the setting sun. I'll see how they respond to the official complaint. If they keep dismissing us, I might just have to remind them of the ramifications. Anthony nodded. Their dinners arrived, but the tension lingered. Meanwhile, Brandon and Destiny bickered playfully about whose sand castle was bigger that day on the beach, seemingly unfazed by the adults' conversation about discrimination. Melissa smiled gently. She was glad the kids could still enjoy their vacation, even if the memory of that flight hung over her like a storm cloud. 2 days passed with no further word from Delta Airlines. Melissa tried to relax, immersing herself in the joys of Hawaii. She took the children snorkeling, admired the reefs, and indulged in local cuisine. Yet a part of her mind remained on edge, waiting for a follow-up call. On the 3rd day, her phone rang again. This time, it was another unknown number. She stepped out onto the balcony, heart pounding as she answered. The voice on the line identified himself as Kevin, the airline's general counsel. His tone was formal, clipped, and he quickly asked for permission to record their conversation for quality and training purposes. Melissa recognized the drill. She accepted while quietly thinking quality and training. Right. She was no stranger to depositions or official interviews. She steeled herself, adopting her courtroom persona, a calm, factual approach. Kevin's questions were pointed, almost combative. He asked for an exact timeline, demanded the names of witnesses, and inquired whether Melissa had spoken or acted in a way that might have caused the flight attendants to perceive her as threatening. He circled back repeatedly to the idea that the staff had an impression that the Mitchell family was causing trouble. Is it possible, Mrs. Mitchell, that your family's interpretation of events was influenced by a pre-existing bias against airline staff? He asked carefully. Melissa almost laughed at the blatant attempt to shift blame. Still, she remained composed. My family and I have flown many times, she answered. I have never lodged a complaint until now. This was not a mild annoyance. It was an unmistakable pattern of racial bias. Kevin's voice droned on, trying to pick apart her account. At one point, he referenced internal crew statements that alleged Melissa had threatened them. They claim you said you'd make sure they regret their behavior. Melissa's jaw clenched. That's false. I never said that. You can ask the passengers around us if I made any threats. I did say I'd file a formal complaint, which is within my rights. Kevin paused, then asked in an almost casual tone, Mrs. Mitchell, may I ask your occupation? Melissa inhaled. This was her moment. She debated lying or deflecting, but decided the time for subtlety was over. I'm a U.S. federal judge, she said, letting each word land like a gavel strike. There was a stunned silence on the line. Her voice steady, she continued. I've presided over numerous civil rights cases, and I'm quite familiar with the law regarding public accommodation and non-discrimination. If necessary, I will ensure that the relevant authorities are made aware of this incident, including the possibility of a civil suit. Kevin's composure cracked slightly. She heard him shuffle papers. When he spoke again, he sounded rattled. I see, he stammered. Well, we certainly don't want this to escalate. Let's see if we can reach an understanding that satisfies everyone. It was exactly the shift in tone Melissa had anticipated. She had no intention of misusing her position, but she also knew the power of naming it. If the airline was hoping she'd quietly drop the complaint, they now had to think again. She outlined her conditions succinctly: a thorough investigation, disciplinary action for any staff proven to have discriminated, and a written apology acknowledging wrongdoing. Kevin promised to confer with senior management and get back to her. They ended the call. Melissa returned to the table where the kids and Anthony were finishing breakfast. She exhaled deeply. "It's out in the open now," she told Anthony. He nodded with a small smile of encouragement. "Good." 4 more days passed. Melissa and her family continued their Hawaiian adventures. But the looming question of accountability followed her like a persistent shadow. On their final day in Honolulu, her phone buzzed again. This time, the call was from a top executive at Delta. The executive apologized profusely, confirming that their internal review found serious procedural lapses in how the Mitchell family's requests were handled. The flight attendants in question had been placed on administrative leave pending further investigation. Though the executive stopped short of admitting explicit racial discrimination, the subtext was clear. Melissa pressed for a statement acknowledging the possibility of bias. The executive danced around the issue, but promised a formal letter of apology would be sent to her home address, along with a significant credit toward future travel. Melissa reiterated that this wasn't about money, but about preventing such incidents from happening again. The executive assured her they were rolling out mandatory bias training sessions for staff. A small victory, but a victory nonetheless. She thanked them for the update and ended the call. Anthony, listening from across the room, smirked. "Sounds like they're finally taking you seriously." Melissa gazed at the horizon, the shimmering ocean beyond their hotel balcony. "I just hope it makes a difference for other families," she said. She wished justice were as simple as one phone call, one complaint. But she knew systemic change was an ongoing fight. Still, it was a start. That afternoon, as they prepared to depart for the airport, the kids chattered excitedly about the snorkeling trip and the photos they'd show their friends. Melissa quietly took one last look around the hotel suite. A sense of calm washed over her. Her father once told her that we all have an obligation to leave places better than we found them. She believed the same principle applied to societal structures. Maybe her voice, coupled with her position, could indeed spark change. The Mitchell family arrived at the airport, checked in their bags, and waited at the gate with a new sense of alertness. When boarding began, an agent recognized their name from the system and offered them an upgrade to first class, a complimentary gesture from the airline. Melissa exchanged glances with Anthony. Reluctantly, they accepted. Why not enjoy some space on the flight back, especially for the kids? As they boarded, they encountered Marcus, the one attendant who had shown them a hint of kindness. He was wearing a subdued expression. He offered them a quiet, genuine smile. "Good to see you folks again. I heard about everything." He stopped there as though unsure how much he could say. Melissa nodded. "Thank you for being polite to us when others weren't," she replied. Marcus looked down, mumbled something about how he wished he could have done more. Then he guided them to their seats in first class, offering a quick orientation to the recliners, the entertainment system, and the menu. This time, the difference in service was night and day. Halfway through the flight, a middle manager from the airline introduced herself and apologized in person. She offered them the best meal choices, extra blankets for the kids, and a vow that Delta was actively reviewing our training protocols. Melissa accepted the apology with guarded optimism. She understood that sometimes the real test is how a company changes over the long haul, not just in one flight. Upon landing back in Atlanta, the Mitchell family retrieved their luggage and headed home weary but content with their vacation overall. The next morning, while sipping coffee in her home kitchen, Melissa checked her mailbox. Sure enough, there was a formal letter of apology from Delta's legal department. In it, they stated they recognized the family had not been treated with respect and courtesy, and that an internal inquiry confirmed lapses in performance and potential bias. They included a promise to review and improve our standards of service, citing ongoing diversity and sensitivity training. Melissa read the words carefully, then tucked the letter into a folder marked Case Materials. She had every intention of following up to see if these promises turned into real reforms. She might have been a judge, but in the eyes of the airline employees who discriminated against her family, she had first been just another black mother traveling with her kids. That was a sobering reminder that prejudice could rear its head anywhere at 30,000 feet or on the ground. Word of Melissa's experience spread quietly among her colleagues and friends, some of whom were also public figures. A few local reporters reached out for comment, intrigued by the story of a federal judge facing discrimination on a commercial flight. Melissa declined interviews, not wanting to sensationalize what she hoped would be a catalyst for corporate self-reflection. Meanwhile, from within Delta Airlines, rumors circulated about that flight with the judge. In break rooms and staff briefings, employees debated whether the incident was overblown or a genuine symptom of a deeper issue. Some flight attendants quietly admitted they too had noticed pockets of bias among their peers. Bias that needed addressing. Carl and Denise, on administrative leave, faced scrutiny from HR. They provided statements claiming they'd been overworked, stressed, and that any perceived slights were unintentional. Investigations revealed other passengers had also complained about them in previous flights, albeit on smaller matters. In the end, the airline required them to complete an extended course in cultural competence and passenger relations, with the warning that any further infractions would result in termination. Marcus, though not without minor criticism for not speaking up more, was praised for at least trying to help. Over the ensuing months, Delta implemented a new bias awareness program for flight crews rolled out in phases across their global network. It wasn't the ultimate solution to systemic racism, nor was it perfect, but it was a step in a better direction. And for Melissa, that step validated her belief that one firm stand against discrimination, even in a personal context, could have a ripple effect on an entire system. Through it all, the Mitchell family found solace in each other. Destiny and Brandon, now more aware of how prejudice can manifest, carried forward a keen sense of justice, no doubt inspired by their mother's steadfast example. Anthony continued to remind them that compassion and knowledge are the best shields against ignorance. And Melissa returned to her courtroom, presiding over cases that often involved complex social justice issues. Whenever she felt fatigued by the grind of legal battles, she remembered that flight. She recalled the moment she quietly flashed her judge's badge, not to boast, but to demand the respect that should be freely given to every human being. In that memory, she found renewed strength to uphold the law and champion fairness, both on the bench and in everyday life. In the end, the Mitchells learned that karma can indeed strike back in unexpected ways. For them, it arrived not in the form of vengeance, but through a gradual shift in how an entire airline approached its customers. And for that, the family walked away proud and ever vigilant. This powerful story isn't just about one family's turbulent flight. It's a stark reminder that injustice can appear anywhere, even in the friendly skies. Melissa Harding. Mitchell stood firm and used her voice to demand what each of us deserves: respect and fairness. Her example shows that when we confront prejudice, we create ripples of change that can transform entire institutions. If you've ever felt overlooked or mistreated, let this serve as a beacon: your voice matters. By sharing stories like this, we make sure the world pays attention, and we spark conversations that lead to real progress. Thank you for joining us on this emotional journey. If this story resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe to help spread the message. Together, we can stand up for what's right, because each step forward makes a difference for everyone. Safe travels and keep fighting the good fight.